Honolulu, 1976. For 3 years, federal prosecutor Michael Sterritt has worked tirelessly to bust the Hawaiian crime syndicate. He had little support from the Department of Justice thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., but through sheer tenacity and will, he's successful in putting the mob's kingpin, Napi Palawa, behind bars. However, during his investigation, he notices a peculiar new criminal element. Japanese nationals, with amputated fingers and florid, full-body back tattoos, featuring designs of tigers, dragons, and samurai. Hawaii is a verdant paradise of illicit vice, and these Yakuza, Sterritt hypothesized, could potentially fill in the power vacuum left in the Hawaiian criminal underworld, and even reach the US mainland. Washington was incredulous at such stories, and told Sterritt to tone down the sensationalism if he wanted the DOJ to take this Japanese connection seriously. There just wasn't much information about the Yakuza in English, so Sterritt kept his head down and made further inquiries with both local police and Japanese authorities. The latter proved difficult to cooperate with, refusing to release the names of known Yakuza members. But what Sterritt pieces together is staggering. The Yakuza outnumber the American Mafia 5-1, and on their home islands exert power over nearly every facet of Japanese life. Politics, industry, construction, sports, even movies, in addition to typical criminal ventures like extortion, drugs, and gambling. By far the strangest aspect was how these Japanese gangsters cultivated the image of a corporate samurai, highly ritualized, honor-bound criminals who worked out of normal office buildings in business suits with lapel pins broadcasting their gang affiliation in public. The elaborate tattoos underneath their suits reveal the Yakuza's seedier origins, a painful rite of passage, inked in the traditional style, slowly by hand. Their amputated pinkies are the result of yubutsume, ceremonial self-mutilation, used to show devotion to the boss or atone for offenses against him. And unlike their American mafia counterparts, the Yakuza are largely accepted in the eyes of the Japanese public, who take their chivalric presentation at face value. This was fairly new to US agencies in 1976, who up to that point almost exclusively focused on organized crime on the American East Coast. But a whole year before Michael Sterritt's reports put them on the DOJ's radar, the Yakuza actually made their big Hollywood debut. And the 1974 film, simply titled
The Yakuza.
A retired hard-boiled detective and World War II veteran, played by, who else, Robert Goddamn Mitchum, returns to Japan to rescue his friend's kidnapped daughter from the titular crime syndicate, and finds himself an alien in a world defined by a rigid code of honor. The film's script also marks the debut of Taxi Driver scribe and everyone's favorite Calvinist Facebook uncle, Paul Schrader. He co-wrote it with his brother Leonard, who while living in Japan, immersed himself in Yakuza culture, frequenting their bars and even writing magazine articles about the Yamaguchi-gumi, the largest Yakuza organization in the country. Leonard Schrader arguably knew more about the Yakuza in 1974 than the DOJ and FBI combined. The Schrader brothers quickly became weeaboos for the Yakuza film as a genre, and in many ways, the Yakuza is an introduction for Americans to both the criminal organization itself and the idealized version of it that had existed in Japanese cinema for decades. The tattoos, the corporate aesthetic, the yubutsume, the complex hierarchies, the narratives about the crushing burden of duty. What were familiar tropes for a Japanese audience were lurid and exotic for Western audiences, or at least that's how director Sidney Pollack presents them in the movie. True to a Schrader film, there is a stew of masculine angst and unhealed trauma boiling underneath all that. Yet even with a can't-miss premise, a legendary leading man, a then white-hot director, and 3 all-time great screenwriters, Robert Towne was brought on for some rewrites, the Yakuza flopped at the box office. The movie was made about 5 years too early, as America would only truly become Japanophilic in the Reagan 80s, amidst Nippon's economic miracle and the real-life Yakuza grabbing headlines stateside. Still, as the first Hollywood movie of its kind, the Yakuza anticipated the mythical draw the Goomies would have over Western audiences, and set the template for how they would be depicted in American films to come. Though before that, the cinematic Yakuza already had a long, meandering journey in its home country, shaped by war, political turmoil, economic boom and bust, and even by the real-life Yakuza gangs themselves. A narrative history that goes back further than you think, even before movies ever reached the shores of Japan. If we're gonna understand the Yakuza film, we need to learn about the origins of the Yakuza themselves. So let's time warp to 17th century Japan. With the help of a quirked-up white boy, Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu unifies the Japanese Isles, bringing peace after 150 years of near-constant warfare. The bad news is that there are a whole lot of samurai suddenly unemployed. Most would settle down and become merchants or bureaucrats, but many who could not adapt formed roving gangs of bandits called Kabuki-mono, the crazy ones. They wore flamboyant clothing and hairstyles, talked to each other in their own slang, and were bound together by dogged loyalty. Sound familiar? Actually, modern-day Yakuza don't identify themselves with the historical Kabuki-mono, but rather the bands of citizen police that formed to defend against these samurai marauders, the Machi Yako. Their ranks were made up of the common class, merchants, clerks, artisans, and laborers. They became folk heroes, disorderly rogues who stood up for the little guy when the upper classes either neglected or exploited them. The greatest of these Machi Yako was Chobei Banzuin, a labor broker who, like modern-era gangsters, hired out for construction during the day and ran a gambling joint at night that allowed him to recover some of the salary he paid to his workers. Tales abound of his good deeds in service of the people of Edo, protecting women from assault and uniting people of all classes. His devotion to chivalry would lead to his downfall, as seen in the 1951 film Oedo Gonin Otoko, 5 Men of Edo. Chobei's arch-rival, the samurai gang leader Mizuno Jirazumon, kills his housekeeper after discovering she had cracked his fine chinaware that he had planned to use as dowry on a young princess. One of Chobei's men puts on a kabuki play to expose the deed to the public and to instigate a decisive conflict between the gangs. Chobei accepts an invitation by Mizuno to negotiate the release of a hostage and broker a peace, but then while preparing a bath is jumped unarmed by his rival. Chobei looks the samurai dead in the eye, and according to one kabuki play, says, "I knew I would be killed if I came here, but if it was rumored that Chobei held his life so dearly, it would be an everlasting disgrace upon my name. You shall have my life for nothing. I have iron nerves, so lance me to the heart, without the slightest reluctance." Mizuno pauses for a few seconds in introspection before impaling the Machi Yako, but says he was too great to be killed. And he was absolutely correct. The age of the Kabuki-mono and the Machi Yako was relatively short-lived. The shogun cracked down on both groups later in the century, but 5 Men of Edo's play within a movie hints at how their legends lived on, and even flourished in Japan's burgeoning theater culture. And through that, their populist badassery became the image that all Yakuza aspire towards. The true direct lineage of the modern-day Yakuza actually starts 100 years later, when shady street peddlers, Takiya, and professional gamblers, Bakuto, began to formally organize for their own economic and legal interest, plying their respective trades in city markets and gambling dens along the rest stops on the Imperial Road to Kyoto. The Bakutos would play a Baccarat-style card game familiar to any Like a Dragon fan, called Oichu Kabu. At the end of a round, one's hand would be added up, and the last digit of the sum total determined the winner, with 9 being the best hand and 0 being the worst. Thus, a draw of 8, 9, 3, or in Japanese, Yakuza, would add up to 20, a worthless hand, befitting a class of people that were deemed good for nothing by Edo period society. The Takiya were similarly the lowest rung of a merchant class that was itself considered the dregs of the feudal order, whose money-minded occupation was the very antithesis to the honorable samurai. The Takiya didn't help that reputation, selling shoddy goods like bonsai trees without roots or literal snake oil medicine. However, 250 years of Tokugawa peace allowed the merchant class to slowly accumulate wealth, and likewise the Yakuza gangs expanded beyond the gambling houses and street stalls into surfaces like labor contracting, construction, and even firefighting. And yeah, also extortion and protection rackets. Still, in a rigid, feudal society, they were one of the only avenues of upward economic mobility for those at the very bottom of Japan's caste system, namely the wretched Eta. Those Eta could find security and social belonging within the Takiya and Bakuto gangs, who structured themselves after the traditional Japanese family unit. The boss, the Oyabun, acts as an authoritative father figure, who would take in and mentor his Kobun, as if they were his own sons. The Kobun are expected to reciprocate with unquestioned obedience and loyalty to the Oyabun, from performing mundane chores like polishing dice or babysitting, to at the more extreme end, risking their lives in turf wars, or taking the fall for their boss's crimes. Elaborate rituals such as the exchanging of sake cups gave religious weight to initiations, mediations between gangs, and the notorious punitive finger-cutting. For the Eta banned from public Shinto shrines, the rituals were a means of spiritual expression, perhaps even cult-like, as the newly initiated Kobun were to put duty to their blood brothers in Oyabun above even their own biological families. That broad sense of obligation is expressed in the Japanese word giri, which is contrasted with ninjo, roughly meaning compassion or human feeling. For the Yakuza, that relates to their perceived place as both a pillar of the community and a noble protector of the outcast. Giri and Ninjo combine to form the code of chivalry, Jingi, for the ideal Yakuza, a Robin Hood type figure who, in spite of his low social status, is every bit as honorable as the samurai. Now, how much the Yakuza of yore ever truly abided by Giri, Ninjo, and Jingi, as we'll see, is debatable. Nevertheless, those principles form the foundational character of the narrative Yakuza, first in oral folk legend, then in song and kabuki theater, followed by pulp history novels, and finally, the Yakuza leapt onto the silver screen. Chuji's travel diary was a trilogy of silent Jedi Geki films, of which sadly only the final chapter survives in full. Nevertheless, they proved to be some of the most influential movies in Japanese cinema history. For comparison, early Jedi Geki looked like this. Framed on a flat 2D plane, almost entirely in medium shot with minimal editing. They're blocked and staged like theater plays because that's pretty much what they were. Filmed versions of popular kabuki dramas. Even the action scenes have a rehearsed, dance-like rhythm to them. But a new style emerged in the 1920s that abandoned much of the stuffy kabuki formality and embraced Western ideas and filmmaking techniques, pulling the entire genre into modernity, in what film scholar Donald Ritchie termed the new Jedi Geki. Director Ito Daisuke led the charge with crackling pulp tales of rebellious samurai and criminal anti-heroes, told with a visceral, turbo-charged energy. He was the kind of gonzo action movie virtuoso who would rig a camera onto a cameraman and throw him in the middle of battle. Ito's name became synonymous with movement, like literally. His name, Oedo Daisuke, translates to I love movement. He definitely lives up to that title in Chuji's travel diary. The action here is a chaotic maelstrom of bodies and blades, and Ito's camera slashes across the scene like a katana, yet it's all deceptively composed. Most of the time the camera is actually locked down in these eye-catching angular shots, with multiple layers of kinetic blocking. Even for something as simple as a guy brushing his teeth before tea time. Richie compares Ito's compositions to the iconic Japanese woodblock print art of the 18th century, and in that regard the characters move across those frames with a brushstroke flourish. It should be no surprise that Ito's films left an impression on a young Akira Kurosawa. The dusty moodiness of the exterior scenes in certain ways resemble the American Western more than the noirish urban shadows the Yakuza genre would become. The Diary of Chūji is a Butch Cassidy, Unforgiven-style elegy to the outlaw as legend, with the six-shooter replaced with the swift flash of katana steel. Chūji tries to steer his employer's ne'er-do-well son away from joining a local Yakuza gang, only for himself to be dragged back to his old violent life. And you know, that's basically the premise to about a half-dozen John Wayne films. If Ito Daisuke is analogous to John Ford, then Okochi Denjiro is his Duke Wayne. They made 26 movies together, and Okochi's performance as Kunisada Chūji straddles the line between arch theatricality and the naturalism that the new Jedi Geki directors strove for. He moves in slow, deliberate, expressionistic gestures, and just the way he muscles his face to look like a kabuki mask is hypnotic. He could kill a man with just those piercing eyebrows. I mean, he's Kazuma Kiryu with a top knot. Though the true magic of Okochi's Chūji are the small fleeting moments when that unflinching facade cracks and you see glimpses of vulnerability. Of a duty-bound man, unable to reciprocate a young woman's love, who at the end, when laid low with sickness and stroke, desperately tries to cling to the last shreds of dignity he has left. The acting can come off a bit stagey, but amplified by Ito's evocative close-ups, is still effective and undeniably recognizable as the cinematic Yakuza. Every single leading man working in the genre, from Ken Takakura to Joe Shishido to Beat Takeshi, is emulating Okochi Denjiro in some way. Like the classic cinematic cowboy, Kunisada Chūji represents an archaic chivalry, soon to be outmoded by the coming onslaught of modernity that would upend Japanese society at large. Characters are dwarfed by industrial-sized sake barrels, and in his absence, Chūji's mistress seizes control of the gang by the barrel of a Western-style revolver, the only one in the film. She is loyal to the Oyabun to the end, and in the final scene, she brandishes the gun in one last act of defiance against the law, before Chūji instructs her to lay the weapon down in submission to the new order. All she asks of the police in return, in the closing lines of the film, is to likewise do your duty. However, Kunisada Chūji, the noble folk hero, barely resembles Kunisada Chūji, the historical Yakuza. In actuality, he was kind of a scumbag. I mean, obviously, someone who uses gambling to skim money off the working class, who traffics in intimidation, gang violence, and occasionally murder, is generally not a good guy. But even among the Edo period gangs, Chūji was loathed as a spoiled rich kid interloper, with a complete disregard for the codified order that kept the Bakuto and Takiyas in equilibrium. He used his father's wealth to attract followers and bribe officials into carving out his own fiefdom in the criminal underworld, and his rise was precipitated by unprovoked attacks against other bosses, without a formal declaration of war, a flagrant violation of the accepted Yakuza code. Chūji also engaged in conspicuous acts of robbery that brought the unwanted attention of the authorities, which would eventually lead to his downfall. The Kanto Regulatory Patrol mustered up a posse of 600 men, some of them likely members of rival gangs, to hunt him down. and in 1850 he was crucified by the Tokugawa government in front of 1,000 people. But a funny thing happened just 3 years later. Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in a gunboat at Edo Bay to, firmly insist that Japan open its country to Western trade.
Truth is, the game was rigged from the start.
What followed was 3 decades of political instability, civil war, and finally one of the most rapid and radical social revolutions in human history, the Meiji Restoration. Western ideas of technology, government, and culture were embraced. The samurai were abolished, and peasants became citizens. In a few short years, the Japanese military went from a decentralized hereditary hierarchy, armed with 17th century muskets and wooden ships barely fit to sail the open seas, to fully modernized professional ranks, with the latest repeating rifles along with a fleet of steam-powered ironclads able to go toe-to-toe with the big dogs on the world stage. Trade agreements were negotiated on more favorable terms, and the goods and cash that flowed in turned out to be a major boon for the Yakuza. The Oyabuns, who fought alongside the victorious Imperials in the Boshin War, were rewarded with unprecedented, if unofficial, political leverage in the new government, taking on the role of discreet middlemen to mobilize the almost entirely agricultural labor force into an industrialized powerhouse. The feudal system was finally broken, and in the spirit of egalitarianism that took over Japan, as well as the new cultural cachet the Gumis gained, notorious Yakuza were cleaned up and reimagined as populist heroes. Like with the American Western, Japanese playwrights, pulp novelists, and later filmmakers decided to print the legend. These tales of chivalry had a fairly rigid formula. The good Yakuza, who ardently sticks to his jingi, uses diplomacy before violence, is the champion of the common man, and wears traditional Japanese clothing, opposes the bad Yakuza, who are greedy, corrupt, belligerent, exploit the working class, and prefer the styles of Western materialism. The Meiji Restoration was such a sudden societal shock, the history preceding it became malleable, both for narrative and political purposes. And nostalgia for Japan's pre-modern past took root relatively quickly. In certain respects, the folk image of the Yakuza is reactionary, representing traditional, paternalistic Japanese values, resistant to modernity. Compared to the relationship between lord and samurai, the Oyabun and Kobun were much more relatable to the everyday worker, sweating away in factories and office buildings. That increasing disillusionment with the westernized Japan being bonded more by money than by familial loyalty directly fed the allure of the Yakuza. Towards the turn of the century, the Gumis themselves would become directly intertwined with ultra-nationalist politics. But we'll get to that later. On the flip side, the Bakuto, along with the masterless Ronin samurai, also embodied the rebellious and nonconformist ideals that sprouted up during the liberal Taisho democracy of the 1920s. The new Jirokichi depicted a historical past of relentless injustice, and their anti-heroes at times questioned the very Bushido code that lay at the foundation of both the feudal order and the nationalist ideal of modern Japan. If you've ever seen a movie or anime where a lone, brooding samurai wanders into town and single-handedly slices up the corrupt and the wicked, this era is pretty much where it all started. The politics of the new Jirokichi overlapped with the tendency film movement, of which Ito Daisuke also worked in, that incorporated leftist social justice messaging in Japanese cinema. In Chuji's travel diary, Ito frames the otherwise bourgeois Yakuza boss as a distinctly anti-cop outcast, who neither fit in Edo feudal society, nor in Japan's future as part of the global capitalist economy. Ito established a lot of the cinematic character of the Yakuza film as a genre, yet unlike the movies that followed, he stopped short of completely valorizing its hero. The Yakuza is always doomed. But here, Chūji never makes it look cool or effortless. He fights with the frenzy of a wounded animal, and he meets an emasculating end, too physically weak to go out literally guns blazing, instead relying on his woman as the last line of defense. In spite of, or maybe because of, the dour kick-in-the-balls ending, Chuji's travel diary proved to be a smash hit, and the studios quickly cashed in on the Yakuza's emergence in cinema. Pulp novelist and dramatist Hasegawa Shin is credited with canonizing the Yakuza in modern fiction, and his gritty, working-class stories about morally frayed but ultimately noble Bakuto were among the first to be adapted to screen. What Raymond Chandler was to film noir, Hasegawa was to the Yakuza film, and his traveling gambler tale, Kutsukake Tokujiro, would see no less than 7 adaptations over the next 40 years. The first of which came in 1929, starring none other than Akochi Denjiro himself. Tokujiro is given food and shelter by a local gang, and is then obligated by his Giri debt to eliminate the last remaining member of a rival Gumi. He reluctantly finishes the deed, but then is asked by the dying Yakuza to take care of his pregnant wife and child, and ever bound by duty and chivalry, the gambler accepts. According to cultural commentator Ian Baruma, Jingi differs from the Western concept of universal justice. Quote, "Justice for its own sake is meaningless to the Japanese hero. His code of honor exists only in the context of his own personal relationships." For Tokujiro, there is no moral contradiction in killing to fulfill his giri. Neither is there in the young widow accepting the guardianship of her husband's murderer. They dutifully perform the transactions required by the social order, even as it tears apart their emotions, their ninkyo. That's the core dramatic tension of the classical Yakuza film. The rest of Kutsukake Tokujiro follows the typical arc of the genre. The Bakuto wants to get out of the criminal lifestyle, but is inevitably pulled back in, culminating in a frantic gang battle, intercut with an absolutely gonzo montage of the widow dying in childbirth, in rhythm with the tolling of a temple bell. Hasegawa Shin's other major work of Yakuza fiction, Mabuto no Haha, In Search of Mother, also frames giri and ninkyo as distinctly maternal virtues. However, the Bakuto searching for his long-lost mom only finds a complete rejection of those values, and denied by his own flesh and blood, he loses himself in the world of violence. In many ways, the Yakuza genre is defined just as much by the absence of motherly figures as it is by the presence of the fatherly oyabun. The 1931 adaptation reflects that yearning for maternal harmony in these delicately framed vignettes of the natural world, depicting a bond that is hardwired at a very fundamental biological level. Without the balance of the feminine, the Yakuza is at the mercy of his own masculine id. Though, curiously, the 31 film also adds an unambiguously happy ending, where the Bakuto literally throws aside his sword and embraces his mother and sister in reconciliation. Is this a hokey attempt to make sure the audience goes home happy? Or perhaps a humanistic subversion of the tragic Yakuza archetype, where motherhood triumphs over all? The question of where women fit in the societal order became increasingly pointed as the country swung hard into conservatism over the next decade. That tension between the traditional and the modern, cosmopolitan and nativist, takes center stage in 1933's Dragnet Girl, a savory little gangster melodrama from legendary director Ozu Yasujiro. It's a story about a career hoodlum who is caught between the love of two women, the fast life of his glitzy mall, and the quiet domesticity of an innocent shop clerk. The gangsters here barely resemble the traditional image of the Japanese Yakuza, either in aesthetic or their organization. They wear fedoras, neatly fitted suits, and long, flowing western overcoats instead of kimonos. They hang around boxing gyms and jazz clubs, rather than sake houses or gambling hideaways. The immediate allure here isn't kinship or honor codes, but lavish materialism, not unlike contemporary Hollywood gangsters like Jimmy Cagney or Paul Mooney. But I guarantee none of those guys look as effortlessly cool as Joji Oka casually leaning back and balancing a cigarette between his lips. Critics at the time said the film reeked of butter, an epithet lobbed at art that wasn't deemed Japanese enough. Though, speaking as an American, butter tastes good. Yet underneath that slick-as-hell affect is still a brooding, chivalrous Yakuza and his dutiful woman, both pulled by the same ninkyo desires and hurtling towards tragedy. one that parallels what would happen to Japan over the next decade. One can't help but feel the crushing weight of melancholy, knowing that such a free and easy libertine society would soon be literally burnt to ash by militarism and total warfare. In one shot, Ozu uses the two women of the story as visual synecdoche for the cultural conflict of 1930s Japan. Tokiko the mall striding forward in her extravagant dress and pearly white western-style heels, and the meek, domesticated shopkeeper Kazuko, walking in small, tightly mannered steps in a simple kimono and traditional Japanese clogs. They sit on a fault line of femininity. Though perhaps the two sides aren't totally irreconcilable, the relationship between the two women is also drenched in lesbian subtext. Hell, even more than that. Tokiko straight up says she's fallen for the shop girl, much in the same way Joji has. However, much like the classic Wandering Bakuto, there is no true escape towards that domestic ideal. No matter how hard they try to get back on the straight and narrow, they are outlaws to the end. Kazuko's wannabe gangster brother puts her into a bind, and Joji and Tokiko plan one final Bonnie and Clyde style heist to pay back the money she owes. But the police finally catch up to them, and the stylish flapper and the dashing mobster, the two symbols of Western individualism, are handcuffed together in a lover's embrace. Such compassion and humanity would become increasingly fleeting in Japan. The ideal citizen would bottle up their ninjo and fall in line, day in, day out, clock in, clock out, all in contented, anonymous, dutiful silence. To quote cultural critic Yamato Inohiko, the kind of Japanese depicted by Ozu, with their political apathy, did not contribute to national policy, and were powerless and submissive in the face of an advancing crisis. In one final, super on the nose, yet absolutely devastating image, Ozu lingers on a pair of baby socks knitted by Tokiko, hanging on a fence in a darkened street corner, never to be used for their intended purpose. Though for the lost generation that was born in early 30s Japan, there will be little room for childhood innocence, as the next 15 years of turmoil will shape the filmmakers, movie stars, and audiences that will define the Yakuza film as a more distinct genre. After a decade of natural disasters, economic depression, political violence, and foreign wars, the Japanese public retreated to the comfort of reactionary politics and traditional mores. The Zaibatsu corporations and movie studios followed suit, building closer ties to the nationalist government to reap the profits of a growing Pan-Asian empire. In 1935, years before the government took total control of the film industry, the studios established the Greater Japan Film Association, Dai Nihon Eiga Kyokai, officially a self-regulating body that made sure the industry towed the National Party line in regards to what was being shown in theaters. And yeah, this is all starting to sound a little familiar. As such, crime films were out, especially ones that humanized the criminals. Outlaws and hoodlums would not be glorified in this new age of law and order. But paradoxically, the real-life Goomies were even more in bed with the militaristic government, breaking up strikes, pushing dope onto the Chinese and occupied Manchuria, and organizing cheap, longshore labor, who would then be recruited as Kobun muscle. In July of 1937, Japanese soldiers flooded over China's northern border, marking the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War, a conflict that would claim the lives of over 10 million people, including countless mass atrocities committed by the invading imperial forces. The nationalists now had a vice grip over every facet of society, and the nation plunged into the blackened abyss of totalitarianism, an era known as Kuroi Tanima, the Dark Valley. Released a mere month after the full-scale invasion of China, Humanity in Paper Balloons is a bleak reflection of Japan's national soul. Even more so than the rest of the new Jedi Geki, it shatters the mythic nationalist image of the Edo period into a million little pieces, positing that underneath the facade of honor codes, The only societal language of feudal Japan was exploitation. The abject claustrophobic squalor of a 1700s Edo slum sits in sharp contrast to the sprawling manor owned by the aloof samurai Lord Mori. He views the inhabitants as little more than pests, using a predatory pawnbroker and his gang of Yakuza as middlemen who skim off what little material wealth is left in the community. Shinza, the hairdresser, runs afoul of the local Yakuza boss for operating a gambling house on their turf. After the goons smash his place up, and he's denied a loan to recover the damages, Shinza comes up with a scheme, with help from an alcoholic Ronin, to exact his revenge by kidnapping the pawnbroker's daughter and holding her for ransom. What I find fascinating about humanity in paper balloons, especially in the context of 1937 Japan, is that while it definitely holds to task the greed and casual cruelty of the ruling class, it's not exactly populist. The working poor are shown to be just as exploitative and uncaring. The film begins and ends with desperate tenants dying by their own hand, while their neighbors react largely in apathy. Only Shinza cares enough about his departed neighbor to hold a lively wake honoring the dead. He may not technically be Yakuza, but he embodies the contradictory nature of one more than the actual Bakuto thugs in the movie. In fact, the Japanese title of the film, Ninjo Kamefusen, evokes the very compassionate traits that, if not makes the criminality of the Yakuza righteous, endears them as sympathetic characters. Shinza's gambling joint is simultaneously one of the few true communal spaces in the slums, and also inextricably a place where men, like the Ronin, succumb to their most self-destructive vices. He seethes with proletarian contempt for the kidnapped Okoma, yet also feels the pull of his ninjo for her plight as a woman about to be sold off by her own father in an arranged marriage. Like Shinza, she is every bit the victim of this screwed up class system, where people are commodities and honor is transactional. If word gets out that the bride-to-be was cavorting in the slums, her reputation would be tarnished, and by extension the reputations of the two wealthy men who run the district. However, when the pawnbroker sends his Bakuto thugs to quietly pay Shinza off, he refuses the money, instead presenting a curious counteroffer. He'll return the girl, if the Yakuza boss shaves his head and grovels for forgiveness. It's a total catch-22 for a Yakuza. Submit to someone lesser than you, and you forfeit all your manly pride. Refuse, and you run back to your employer empty-handed, violating the very deity that supposedly binds your entire existence. The Oyabun chooses the latter, sending a subordinate to break the bad news to the pawnbroker, quite literally trying to save face. Unmoved by bribery and threats of violence, Shinza exposes the chivalry of the Yakuza for the fragile construct that it is, by, ironically, becoming a paragon of ninkyo virtue. Eventually, the slum's bumbling landlord reaches a ransom deal for a much greater amount, though still a pittance for the samurai Lord Mori, and yet, Shinza still refuses to take a cut. His only condition is that Okoma's true love, a lowly clerk who works for her father, is there to make the exchange. The fate of the young couple, like much of the final movements of the film, is left in melancholic ambiguity. The woman, exhausted on a tatami mat, entreated by the clerk to run away together from Maori and her father in elopement. But we never get her answer. When the Yakuza goons show up to repay Shinza's insult and blood, the hairdresser accepts his fate, without a fight, his own pride now fully secure. Meanwhile, the wife of the Ronin, who had been crafting the titular paper balloons to support her feckless husband, discovers that he had himself used the kidnapping to extort money from Lord Mori, his father's former master. Unable to live with the shame, she takes the life of both the Ronin and herself. Now with no one to commemorate the dead in a society that places little inherent value in human life, they die without ceremony. Her beautiful, fragile paper balloon floating aimlessly down a slum gutter. That final shot sadly reflects the life of director Yamanaka Sadao. He was a cinematic wunderkind who made 26 films before the age of 28, of which only 3 survive, and sadly some of those lost movies were Yakuza films. In 1935, he directed both an adaptation of the life of Kunisada Chūji and The Village Tattooed Man, a drama about a gangster struggling to adapt to life outside of prison, the latter of which was a collaboration with a theater troupe called Zanjin, who covertly snuck in left-wing politics into their productions, at a time when Japan was becoming increasingly repressive. Yamanaka teamed up with them again for Humanity and Paper Balloons, which is actually a loose adaptation of a morality play from the Meiji era, where Shinza is more of an outright villain, and the slum landlord is a paragon of tricksy virtue, who shows his hairdresser the error of his ways. Yamanaka and his writing partner Shintaro Momura then combined the characters of that kabuki play with the premise of a 1935 French film, Pension Mimosas, about a wayward gambler falling into deeper debt, and drew even heavier inspiration from Gorky's landmark play of bleak lower-class desolation, The Lower Depths. Their goal was to create Jedi Geki that was shot and performed like contemporary set dramas. In the words of Donald Ritchie, Momura's heroes were malcontents in an age of repression, and his dialogue is distinctly modern Japanese, rather than the archaic form of the language typically spoken in other period piece films. Yamanaka's own love for American directors like John Ford and Frank Capra shines through in the rays of humanism that temper the otherwise depressing tone of the film. He presents the slums of Edo as a swampy, suffocating, yet somewhat homey and familiar setting, a hopeless environment in which life can still possess inherent beauty and is worth preserving and celebrating. The Japanese nationalists didn't appreciate either Yamanaka's approach to social realism, nor his cosmopolitan influences. For them, the Jedi Geki genre was a tool to reinforce the national myth that Japan was a divinely superior culture, which in turn was used to justify their brutal expansion across the Pacific Rim. Imperial soldiers were to strive for the image of the Bushido-bound samurai, who even while undergoing extreme hardship is always doggedly loyal to their master, and never questions the intention or motives behind their actions. Once again, not unlike the Oyabun-Kobun relationships that define the Yakuza. The revisionist history of both the samurai and the Yakuza centers around the assumption that there was somehow a purer strain of their respective honor codes, before they were diluted by Western ideas like capitalism and democracy during the Meiji and Taisho periods. However, the pre-modern setting of Paper Balloons is still sick with the disease of avarice. Its political apparatus too calcified and corrupt to do anything but consume the underclass. And the supposed noble folk protectors of the masses, the Yakuza, are themselves enforcers of that oppressive system. While I couldn't find any indication if the film itself was censored or suppressed by the Japanese government, Yamanaka Sadao, perhaps not coincidentally, was conscripted into the army the day of his movie's premiere. On a train departing from Kyoto, pale as a ghost, Yamanaka gave one final haunting farewell to his friend. It's all over. He died a year later on the front lines in China, at the age of 29, another casualty of Japan's lost generation, cut down before truly blossoming into his prime. Still, Yamanaka would hold an outsized influence on the next crop of Japanese filmmakers like Akira Kurosawa, and the creator of Godzilla himself, Ishiro Honda, cut his teeth early in his career as an assistant director on Paper Balloons. With the passing of the Film Law of 1939, the Japanese government consolidated their control over the film studios and movie magazines. Dissident filmmakers and critics were arrested. The number of imported films plummeted, although Leni Riefenstahl's Olympic Nazi propaganda movie was awarded Best Foreign Film in 1940. Then on December 7th, 1941, Japan launched a preemptive strike on the American fleet in Pearl Harbor. The Japanese film industry was now all in on the war effort, but as the conflict dragged on, both the physical materials like film stock and the labor needed to make movies became scarce, and by 1944, only 41 titles were released. The Yakuza themselves had now outlived their usefulness to the government, and like many other young male citizens, their Kobun foot soldiers would either follow their conscription notices to the front lines, or spend their time in prison with all the other undesirables. Finally, on August 6, 1945, the atmosphere ignited. Then again on August 9th. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito formally surrendered. Day 0. Japan would now be remade in the image of its occupiers, though not without friction, and the Yakuza and the filmmakers who portray their exploits would come to embody that friction over the next few decades.